I've known Ray and Laura and their kids for at least 13, 14 years, as long as Daniel and Riley have been around. They're both in school together, and they're both in the band together at Apollo. And Ray works for the Davis County school system. And I know he was the clinical psychologist, or the psychologist for the school system, but I don't know what your title is now.
Behavior specialist.
Pardon?
Behavior specialist.
Behavior specialist for the school system. Anyway, he knows a lot of psychology, and when I told Jim Barr he was going to speak here, he went on and on about all the things that Ray did and all the talks that Ray gives, and said he was really in demand as a speaker. So he's going to talk about anger and the community and schools and churches. So Ray Rock.
I'll be fine. Well, thanks for having me today, guys. I guess I'll first say, man, I am not a theologian, and I'm not anybody that I would consider an expert on this topic. I spent the better part of 27 years working in schools with kids who are angry and hostile. And I do a whole lot of work with students with emotional behavioral disabilities. And can you hear me now? Lift it up. All right. How's that? Better? All right. In 2001, I was fortunate enough to receive some training by a gentleman. He was out of Kansas at the time. He's in New Hampshire now. His name's Malcolm Smith, and he does this work that he calls peaceful interventions. And it's designed really, Malcolm's got a fascinating background. His best friend was murdered on her first day as a school teacher in Kansas City. Malcolm had, at the time, been working with Dr. Carl Menninger in the Menninger Clinic in Kansas. And I didn't know much about the Menninger Clinic, but I found out later Dr. Carl Menninger was a survivor of the Holocaust. And his goal was to create the equivalent of the Mayo Clinic for mental health. And he created this place in the Menninger Clinic in Kansas that was designed to be a really compassionate and peaceful and cutting-edge approach to treating people with mental illnesses. After really cutting his teeth learning from Dr. Menninger, Malcolm Smith decided, his best friend decided to become a teacher, and she was murdered on her first day on the job. And he's really has spent the rest of his life trying to figure out, why did my friend have to die? And what can I do about that? He's one of the first experts that's called in on school shootings, which is sort of where I came in to meeting him, because he does so much work with trying to teach teachers about angry kids and what to do about angry kids. And what I found really helpful with his material was he starts, and this is what I did. This is when I was principal of the alternative school and I worked with so many angry kids. I began by using his approach, which is teach people what anger really is. Once you understand what anger is, you can address anger. As long as it's this thing out there that you don't understand, then it's scary and we're not very effective. Brad actually helped me, and I did this speech a number of years ago, and I'll point out the point at which Brad really challenged me, and it made me think about this in an even deeper way. I think the first place to start, and by the way, I apologize, we were out of school all this week. I didn't make it to my office. I would have had handouts for you guys. What I'll do, Susan, I've emailed this PowerPoint presentation to myself, and if anybody would like it, if you've got an email way to distribute that, I'd be happy to, if anybody would like it, because I did at the end have a lot of citations and links that you can go to specific articles. Because what I would like to do is to move from the basic part, which is what anger is, and then how anger is used by politicians and ministers in churches and in community to really use fear to, I think, manipulate. Is sort of where I'm going with all of this. Malcolm starts with what he calls his rage triangle. And so if you can imagine a triangle, and on one point of that triangle is violence. He says, we're working backwards. In schools, where we begin our work is we have to confront violence in the form of not only school shootings, but even in terms of bullying, in terms of people being unkind, all of that kind of really mean and hostile and cruel behaviors. But he says we often start there, and you go to the second point of the triangle, and the second point of the triangle is anger. See, all violence is preceded by something, and that's something that it is preceded by is anger. You don't get, anger doesn't always lead to violence, but violence is always preceded by anger. But he says that's, our problem is that's usually where we stop. And when you stop there, you're stuck with, when you have somebody who is angry, when you have an angry kid, then all you can do is contain that anger. And what he found was, in doing lots of research, was violence is preceded by anger, but anger is always preceded by one thing, and that one thing is fear. Fear produces anger, anger produces violence, and it's this vicious cycle. And what that did for me as a psychologist, as a behavior specialist, is it opened up a lot more doors to what do I do when I have an angry kid to work with? When it was an angry kid who's potentially violent, all I can do is contain the anger. Now I'm dealing with somebody who is fearful. And when you're dealing with fear, that opens doors and opportunities for intervention. And what Brad said, the time that I was speaking at the UU church before, years ago, he said, you know, as a biologist, I've always believed that there were really only two emotions. Remember saying that, Brad? And he said they were fear and love. Now that makes sense to me, because I also say, you know, everything that I'm saying here, I'm going to say about the anatomy and the biological effects is true not only of fear, but it's also of love. Because I'll say, you know, the worst decisions I've made in my life, I've made when I'm angry. Because you react, you don't think, you say the most harsh things only when your guard is down, when you're angry with the people that you love the most. But when Brad said that, I said, you know, I've also said that the corollary to this is the worst decisions that you make in your life, you make either when you're angry or you're in love. Right? And you're not thinking, correct? That would make sense. It makes sense when you look at primary and secondary emotions, that anger is really a secondary emotion. The primary emotion is fear, and it's survival. Why are you afraid? You're afraid because it kicks in certain things that happen in your brain, which we'll talk about, that puts us in survival mode, which allows us to react and respond to the world in a way that keeps us safe. And so, where I learned from Malcolm Smith was, he's done some really fascinating things. He's been in almost every one of the school shootings. And one of them that really struck me was, not only does he go into school shootings where the shooter dies, but he's been into school shootings where the shooter lives. And they've really done a lot of work on what's going on with the school shooters after the incident. And in one in particular he talks about, I don't remember which one, it may have been the Pearl, Mississippi, I think, but I'm not sure. Anyway, the shooter was disarmed by a student, and when they arrested the shooter, they took him to the hospital. They also took the person who disarmed him to the hospital. They took vital signs when they first got a hold of them, took them to the hospital, took vital signs. An hour later, they had almost identical physiological reactions in terms of heart rate and all kinds of stuff. And he's really started looking into what happens to somebody when they're angry. And what they found is when you're angry, and this is fairly old, this probably evolved since then, they determined there were at least 172 different chemical reactions that take place in the body when you're angry. Now, they also look at somebody who's afraid. Guess how many chemical reactions take place in the body when you're afraid? 172. And this is where he started to make that connection between, biologically, this is probably the same thing that's happening with fear and anger. And where this helps me is, I start working with teachers, I'll work with secretaries sometimes, take for instance a secretary who is working in a school and somebody comes in to sign their child out of school, but they've got a court order that let's say the mother has gotten from a judge that says that this father is not allowed to see their child. And now the secretary has to tell this man, I'm sorry, I can't let you see your child. Or the bus driver who has a parent who gets on the bus because their child has been bullied. And they get on the bus and they become angry and start to lash out at kids. So we have lots of situations in schools where we're confronted with anger. And what Malcolm has found out is if you don't understand that and you respond wrong, you can produce an anger reaction in the person who's confronted. And now you've got two angry people. And now you've got a recipe for disaster. So in my PowerPoint, it shows a nice slide. It shows the brain and everything, and you can see it if you'd like to see it. But essentially, I want you to think about it this way. Think about the brain. And this is fairly simplistic. This neurological research goes back to the 50s, which, if you understand neurological research, that's very, very old. It was updated in the 90s, but imagine the brain, and you think about the brain and the crinkly part of the brain on the outside. That's your neocortex. And your neocortex is what we believe is the part of your brain where logical thought and reasoning take place. It's the part where we think deeply about things. Now, that part of the brain is the part of the brain that we call the human brain. Just below that, we've got the midbrain. The midbrain is where we think memories are stored. If I asked you what you had for dinner last night, you could probably recall that information out of the midbrain into the human brain, and you could respond to me. But down at the base of your brain, at the brain stem, is what we'll call the snake brain. Now, if you were to dissect a snake and look at the brain, tell me if I'm wrong, Brad.
Well,
Yeah.
snakes always get a bad rap, so I say
Oh man.
speak. But okay.
Once again, I'm not the expert here in the biology of it, but what I've always been told, you dissect a snake's brain, you dissect a human brain, and this part of the human brain looks identical to a snake's brain. It doesn't have all of the extra parts that allows us to do all the other things. Now, this is the key. When that part of your brain, the brainstem, is activated, survival mechanisms take over. The amygdala kicks in, and it does all these other things that I can show you. You can see on the slides later if you'd like them. That like it releases certain hormones and certain neurotransmitters, and essentially you go into fight or flight mode, and that exists just for survival. It protects us. It makes sense. Now, when the snake brain is activated, the human brain doesn't work anymore. That make sense? And this is really important information when I work with teens on who are angry, is to understand, because this thing of anger is for so many people something that's out of control, something I don't understand. And when you start to understand how the brain operates, it really helps you to figure out how to change things. When the snake brain is activated, the human brain stops working. Another way to say that is, when the snake brain is activated, you are no longer rational. And if you're dealing with somebody who is not rational, you can't be rational with an irrational person. Now, all of that was very interesting, and it leads to lots of different things and lots of different ways that I work with teachers on how do you deal with kids who have the propensity to act out angrily, and what do you do if you're confronted with this? And there's a whole lot of interesting things. I'm going to move right to this whole idea that when your emotions are elevated, your ability to think starts to lessen. Does that make sense? Now, state police train almost this exact same stuff. With how do you walk into a volatile situation. They use something called verbal judo, which is very similar to this peaceful intervention stuff. And I was at a training not too long ago, just the last month or so, and a police officer said the same thing. He said, this is interesting, as the ego is elevated, thinking is lowered. He said they have to really teach police this because they get this attitude of you walk into a situation and somebody says pig or something derogatory, and all of a sudden it becomes about me and it becomes ego. And they really teach police officers how to disengage that part of the ego where it's not about you, but I think it's the exact same mechanism that if you can activate somebody's fear mechanisms, you can get them afraid, then what happens is that lowers their ability to think logically and rationally. Does that make sense? Now, having been raised in the tradition that I was raised in a not just Catholic environment, but an extremely orthodox, fundamentalist, ultra-traditional Catholic environment, my parents were literally card-carrying members of the John Birch Society. We were trained to believe that there was a communist behind every corner, that everything that the politicians did that you didn't like, that we didn't agree with, was a conspiracy by the communists. That's exactly how I was raised. And I started to look at this information and start to say, why is it that I have such a reaction often when I go to churches? And I started to really piece together because politicians and ministers so often operate from this fear base that what happens is, as soon as I start to hear that stuff, I go to a place I don't like. And I start to build up my walls. And now I understand neurologically what's happening is once we can get you scared of hell, scared of the liberals, scared of the conservatives, because both sides do it. But once we can get somebody engaged at this level of the brain that produces fear, guess what they stop doing? They stop thinking, don't they? And so I started to look, that's my hypothesis. Is there information out there that really backs up some of this? And guess what I found? Yes, there is. A great quote here by Jim Palmer. I see a lot of people post him on Facebook a lot. But I really like this. He says, one way religion stunts a person's spiritual development is scaring them away from asking questions. Too often people who, quote, question things are viewed as agitators or those who lack faith. Socrates wrote, one good question could be more instructive than 1,000 answers. Pay attention to the questions that linger in your gut, especially those that relate to things that you've been told you should never be questioned. You won't get far into spiritual truth without being a questioner. You won't find spiritual peace, freedom, and well-being without vigorously pressing into the questions you carry deep inside you. And I just really like that. Because I think that's the first thing I was taught. I'll never forget the first real disagreement I had with my mom, who was a delight. She was a saint. But she was really caught up in that real traditional Catholic tradition. And I remember I was in 8th grade and I was listening to Jesus Christ Superstar. And Mom walked in and said, what are you listening to? I had 7 older brothers and sisters, so I had lots of good music. And I said, Jesus Christ Superstar. And she said, you know Father Walton said that's blasphemous. And I said, Mom, I think he's wrong. And she cut me off right there and said, do you think you know more than Father Walton? And I knew at that moment you were not to question. Questions were not welcome, especially if they're questions that challenge what we've been told and we've been fed to believe. We were not allowed to question. I had 2 incidents, and I've shared this with Riley before. You know, he told me one time, he said, I'm an atheist, Dad. And I said, I failed. and I apologized to him, hopefully shortly thereafter, and told him, I said, anything you believe is okay with me, but I want you to back up what you believe. It's okay to believe whatever you believe, but don't believe it because I told you or somebody else told you. And I apologize for having said that to you because it's just like my mom saying, don't believe this because you're not allowed to question it. It is okay to question. And I'm not. So, and I have citations for you if you're interested. I ran across a book, or I think this was an article, called Brainwashing, The Science of Thought Control by Kathleen Taylor. And once again, I have links and citations for anybody who's interested in this PowerPoint. Essentially what she talks about here is she proposes that religious extremism can be treated as a mental illness. Now, isn't that fascinating? And once again, we're not talking about mainstream. What we're talking about is extremism. We often look at the Taliban and those theocracies with such disdain and don't realize that within our midst, there are people who are advocating for policies very similar to those extremists. And what she's proposing is that actually would fit the criteria as a mental illness, which I think is quite provocative. I have a link to a really neat TED Talk, and it's titled, I Used to Be in a Cult, and Here's What It Did to My Brain, by a girl named Diane Van Suter. And this is what she says in her TED Talk. She talks about extremist leaders and extremist followers. Now I want you to go back and think about this in the context of, once we can engage somebody at that fear level, they stop thinking and they're much more willing to drink the Kool-Aid. Right? She's talking about extremist leaders and how they get people to do crazy things. Think about that Westboro Baptist Church that goes around and incites hatred and fear in people. How do those people do it? They engage followers at that level. So she's talking about the extremist leaders and then extremist followers. And she links it to suicide bombers. How do we get people to do things like that in the name of God? And the way we do it is we engage them at a level where they don't think anymore. Now they're blindly following. This was an interesting one. The Republican Brain by Chris Mooney. The science of why they deny science and reality. And this was, I thought, fascinating. And this is actually a description from Amazon.com. From climate change to evolution, the rejection of mainstream science among Republicans is growing, as is the denial of expert consensus on the economy, American history, foreign policy, and much more. Why won't Republicans accept things that most agree on? Why are they constantly fighting against the facts? And once again, I apologize. I'm not trying to get into political debate here. I know many people are like mine, but you know what? I think the left does it just as much as the right. I've taught Riley since he was real little that the difference between fascism and Marxism or communism is nearly not that different in practice. You know, I try my best, even though I know I lean left. I try my best to remain a centrist and try to listen to arguments on both sides, because I think that the further away you go from the center, the more likely you are to get caught into thinking in ways that aren't necessarily productive. I think you need to think about things in a deep way rather than just following what other people have to say. There was an article that really, this starts to look at the physiological differences between people who identify themselves as liberals versus conservatives. And listen to some of these findings. The liberal brain, people who identify themselves as liberal, been huge amounts of research in neurology these days. Liberals have a larger anterior cingulate cortexes. I don't know what the anterior cingulate is, Brad. I know what the cortex is. The cortex is the human brain. That's the part of the brain where you think. That's what I was talking about earlier. They show that people who identify themselves as liberal have larger anterior cingulate cortexes. Liberals are better equipped to make sense of conflicting information, while conservatives are better to recognize a threat. Liberals tend to be more open to new experiences, which by nature of a progressive is exactly what it is. As opposed to the conservative brain. The conservative brain has larger amygdalas. Remember we mentioned the amygdala earlier? It's the part of the brain that's activated. It's the fear center of the brain. It's the part that releases all of the stress hormones when we're angry. Conservatives are more sensitive to feel threatened or anxious in the face of uncertainty. Conservatives tend to be more closed to new experiences. Now, in this research, they clearly say that the study does not show that what these structural differences in the brain, what causes them in the first place. They don't know if maybe people are born that way, or do they arise over time because of experience. This is a nature-nurture debate that we don't know. We know that there's a difference, but we don't know that you can look at a baby and say, oh, this one has a bigger amygdala, they're going to be a conservative, or this one has a bigger, cortex, they're going to be a liberal. But we do know that there are structural differences in how you see the world. Some findings from a nice article that I linked from Salon Magazine called The Conservative Brain. This is some interesting findings. Conservatives tend to believe human nature is fundamentally competitive and self-interest prevails. Then people live in a dangerous world. Compared to liberals, conservatives process dominant emotions like anger and disgust more quickly. They're much more quickly to anger. This is interesting. Research on the dream lives of Americans found that Republicans report nearly 3 times as many nightmares as Democrats. Isn't that interesting? Conservatives were also more likely to initiate physical aggression in their dreams, and they were twice as likely as liberals to dream about male characters. I don't know about that, guys. If you dream about men, you're a conservative. I don't know where that comes from. Left-leaning dreamers, in contrast, report more female characters in their dreams. There we go again. Right-wingers are also more likely to perceive the world, perceive that the world and its morality are increasingly degenerating. And that's real interesting to listen to. Specifically, we'll cite in a minute here, people like Newt Gingrich and Rand Paul, and these people who they begin by, this is what the Founding Fathers believed, and look how we've degenerated. In my mind, those are trigger words to get people into their snake brain and not thinking, because as soon as we can get you there, then the quicker we can get you to, so what you need to do is what I tell you to do, rather than, once you think about that and think what the best reaction should be. I think it's a very interesting difference. Right-wingers are also more likely to perceive the world and its morality, as I said, that it's increasingly degenerating. The political left, in contrast, is more prone to thinking that human nature can evolve into something better. So that's more of a pessimistic versus an optimistic view, and where you go with it. In 2000, the National Election Study asked Americans whether they thought that, quote, newer lifestyles are contributing to the breakdown of our society. Well, we know where that's going to go, don't we? 80% of conservatives agreed with that statement. 59% of moderates agreed, and 49% of liberals agreed. Looking at things like gay rights, 80% of conservatives believe that that's leading to the moral degeneration of our society. 49% of liberals back in 2000. And here's the part I was talking about with Newt Gingrich. His worldview, the moral fabric of America is increasingly deteriorating. He has especially expressed this, quote, degenerating world opinion during the administrations of liberal presidents. And it's not just him. Obviously, we see lots and lots of the ultra-conservatives that begin their conversation by everything's going to hell in a handbaskets because of the liberals. And I was having a conversation with my father-in-law, who's just a dear person. He's a wonderful man. But you can't have a conversation without things very quickly going to Obamacare. I have to brag on Ron. This past summer, he was visiting my in-laws, and he posted on Facebook, well, a fly just landed in my coffee. Damn Obamacare. The political left is well known for its hope that human nature will improve. And then I just added, because this is personal to me. I've had some things happen in my family. There have been some trends that I think are pretty scary. And I'll just mention this, homeschooling. Now, homeschooling in and of itself, I have no problem with. You can't watch Jeopardy's challenge of the young kids and see how many are homeschooled. There's wonderful reasons to homeschool, and there's people who do it in a terrific way. But I have a niece who has been subjected to some pretty horrible things. And in looking it up, what I found was very much the same kind of fear-based stuff. There seems to be a movement within the ultra-fundamentalist to organize homeschools around this real fear-based kinds of stuff. there's whole websites devoted to kids who have escaped religious fundamentalism and homeschooling. As a matter of fact, there's a whole organization called Homeschoolers Anonymous. And the stories that some of these girls have to tell is just horrendous. They talk about how these homes were often characterized by isolationism, Christian fundamentalism, lack of academic supervision. Once free, these children describe those experiences as brainwashing. There's also extremely harsh parenting, which also came up in looking at this whole, once again, this, I think, maybe this is stretching for me. I see it as very much the same kind of thing. Two books in particular that I think need to be looked at. Some books by Gary and Anne-Marie Ezzo called Baby Wise. They've got several books. Baby Wise, Preparation for Parenting, and Growing Kids God's Way. These are the Bibles of many of these homeschool groups. One article that I read, and I've got linked in if anybody wants to see it, they actually cite this other one, this Debbie and Michael Pearl, To Train Up a Child. If you have heard in the last 3 to 4 months, there have been either 2 or 3 deaths, and the parents cite they were just doing To Train Up a Child. A girl that was adopted from Africa, and they found her tied up outside naked and starved to death and died of the elements, and she had been beaten. And the parents, their defense was, we were just doing what these psychologists, the Pearl, said in their book, To Train Up a Child. I have a niece that has experienced both the homeschooling and the beating part of all of this, which made me really interested in this. And to see her mom as this fundamentalist who buys into all of these scare tactics. I have some of those citations if you're interested. And once again, I tried to filter through some things, and I hope that's not too much of a stretch. I think my point is simply this. I do think, and Greg really got me thinking about this a number of years ago, that there are fundamental emotions, one of those being fear, which has its plus side, which is survival. But once activated, it stops us from thinking in logical and rational ways and makes us much more subjective to becoming a part of brainwashing or being led by people who don't necessarily have our best interest. My personal point is anytime I attend a church or hear a politician, that they begin by telling me what I should be afraid of, I automatically shut them out. Because I refuse to be a part of a church, I refuse to vote for a politician whose vision of the world is one in which you have to be scared, and once you're scared, then follow what I tell you to do. Which I believe the Tea Party is exactly where they come from. It's where they operate from. We get them scared, scare the hell out of them, and then we can lead them around by the nose. And that's my personal belief. And I just sort of left it there. So what are the spiritual implications of anger? I think that as responsible members in the community, as churches, then I think that we have to ask ourselves, what's our basis for guiding and leading kids in congregations? Are we all about scaring the hell out of people, or are we? And I know this church is not. But I think it's a valid point to start getting to understand where the people who walk in your doors are coming from. That's exactly where I was coming from. It's exactly my gut feeling. And Susan, I think we were having that conversation. Who was it? Pam, was it? No. It was Amy. You were saying that that Robert, you want to make
Well,
that
I tried
comment?
to have a conversation at work with some people about the United Nations censure of the Vatican over the child molestation. He said they'd had very successful discussions about several pretty controversial topics, but that they would not discuss the censure of the Vatican. No talking. And I told him they can't help it, that since they were really little, they know that you don't say bad things, you don't talk about the Catholic Church because it would help. You can't talk about it, and it's not their fault.
Right.
He said, because, but I know that's the case. They can't talk about it.
And that gets to one of the first points I made when I started talking about spirituality. Don't question. And that's part of I think the dogma is scare them first, and then present a dogma that is not to be challenged. It's infallible. And once we can do that, then I think we can manipulate. I think is what it comes down to. So I don't know what my time is, but yes.
Being a more of a cognitive behavioral therapist, I really believe a choice therapist that, I kind of grew up in some of that, and then I married into some of that. And it's interesting that when I married, my children's father was more liberal than I was, coming from a very conservative-based, Christian-based. And as he became more mentally ill, and I was as mentally ill as he in some ways. I'm not going to lay it all off on him. But I was in school, and Dr. Lane gave us a paper on brainwashing, and it was a real eye-opener for me. And I knew that he was doing that to me and the children. So I made the concerted effort to try and open my children's minds up. But it's easy for the negativity to overwhelm with the fear, okay? And I feel like in many ways my children still live in that fear-based, I know they do, fear-based attitude. But we have to go back to they choose to do that. And it's hard as hell, just like your niece. I'm assuming she's coming out of that.
Well, my great is actually a great niece, and she is 14, so unfortunately, for 4 more years, she's subjected to this.
But, we do have choices. And yes, if you choose to not to make a choice, you've made a choice, and they can stay in that. And like I said, I'm not I'm not putting anybody down for still being in that mind choice, but it is a choice, and they can come out of it. It takes some help.
Pam, would you agree with that one proposition that extremist fundamentalist thinking can be classified as a mental illness?
Yes. Yes.
I see that, absolutely.
I wonder what it is, if the people have been, I'm sure somebody's looked into it, but about people who are raised in a family full of conservatives, or the opposite, raised in a family, but whatever they're taught from the time they were children about how to act and what to do, is that if for some reason it doesn't take, and they do something else, they rebel. It's because they have the small amygdala, and they have a structure of their, or what causes them to be different.
I think that's fascinating. There were 8 kids in my family. 5 of them, I would say, are in the conservative to ultra-conservative. 3 of us have gone to the left. And so what is that? I can tell you for me. For me, it was breaking out of almost the brainwashing. When I went off to Western from Louisville in Bowling Green, I didn't have a car. I couldn't go home. And I was told, don't go to church because you'll go to hell if you go to church in any of the modern churches. And having that experience of not being able to get home and having months, really for about 2 years, I didn't come home hardly at all. And I got to see other people who were Catholics who weren't crazy. They didn't act like those ones that I was, and it was that experience. And there's actually in one of the articles that I've got cited, suggestions for it. And part of it was very much like AA. You've got to move away. You've got to break your ties. You've got to be strong and be able, very much like an alcoholic says, you can't go back into the same environment and expect your behaviors to change. You have to break from those environments to be able to continue to work on yourself and to change those behaviors. Yeah, Mark.
2 things. I found that when I get angry, I get sick.
Oh, yeah.
The chemicals that are released, and I physically feel bad. That may be the reason I'm almost Pollyanna now, but the second thing, I had it only happen one time in my life, and I'm glad it was one time. I was so angry that for, I think it was about 30 minutes, I had an angry blackout.
Wow.
I did not know what I did from the time, I remember getting angry,
Mhm.
and then I remember being at the kitchen sink. But there was about 30 minutes in between that, I have no idea what I did. But I know I didn't drive the car because the engine wasn't hot.
Good. And I have kids report that, and I think a lot of times it's an excuse, but probably there are times that they're probably telling the truth. I do think that, and Malcolm says, the basis of what he's doing is trying to train staff members, because he said, if you have somebody approach you and they're in their snake brain, and it produces fear in you, then you automatically, neurologically go to your snake brain. You've got two people in their snake brain, you've got a recipe for disaster. So a big part of his training is to train teachers so that when confronted by a student, a parent, a colleague who is angry, how not to go to your snake brain so that the results aren't. And he's real clear saying, when there's a school shooting, the person who shot people is the one to blame. But in almost every case he can find somebody in that environment who did the wrong thing. And he does his training, he talks all day long. He always go back to that moment in time. What did you do in that moment in time? Did you escalate or de-escalate? Now, his point is not to place blame on other people. It is clearly the shooter's fault. But there are things that adults in that environment need to understand that they shouldn't do because you will escalate. I have two videos that I'll show in my classes. One is a shooting at, you might see this, you can Google it and find it. It's at a board meeting in Pinellas County, Florida, where a man shows up with a gun and he starts to confront the board. And it's very interesting to watch what they do. Nobody said or did anything wrong. It results in a shooting, and it actually shows him getting shot by a security guard and killed. But the thing that struck me was the superintendent and all the board members kept firing questions at him. The exact wrong thing to do. It's the time to listen, not talk. Don't ask questions. The second one, which I think is absolutely beautiful, was in Georgia. Happened just this past year, where the guy walks into the school with a gun, and it's got the 911 call. You can Google that one too. And this wonderful old black woman, her last name is, oh gosh. It wasn't old. She sounds old. She is wonderful. And the whole time she's on with 911 doing everything by the textbook of how to respond when somebody is angry. By the end, she's calling him honey child. She's a baby now. Now listen, he's ready to give up, but he's afraid y'all shoot him. If I walk in front of him, would you promise you won't shoot me? But she does it all right. And you see, there's ways to approach people when they're angry. And I think it's the same thing when we confront these people who are real angry. Beautiful debate the other night, on creationism versus evolution. And the thing I liked about it didn't go to that angry spot, which I thought it might, but it did. That was really good. Brad?
Last week, it's really interesting, is I remember all the snake brain stuff.
Yeah.
But it's almost like, the light went on again. It's a great topic.
Good.
I really enjoyed it. Last week I was talking about emotion and how almost all of our emotion is caused really just by what we think. I mean, it's not that often that you're actually confronted with a shooter.
That's right.
But it's the thoughts of something that a lot of times doesn't even exist. It's created. But isn't that ironic that our thoughts create the anger,
Right.
and then we can't think? I mean, that's kind of...
It's like a paradox almost. And the reason why I found this approach to be more successful than others is it begins by teaching teenagers, which is what I did when I was in the alternative school, about the brain. That's where you begin. You don't say, I'm going to teach you about how to control your anger. I'm going to teach you about your brain. And I'll go over to the wall and I'll take the light switch and I said, this is what most people see as anger. It's off, it's on. It's off, it's on. It's not that way. And then I start teaching about the brain. And that seems to be a better place to get kids who are open to changing their behaviors.
One of the things that I just heard it on NPR, and they actually did this test on women, which is quite unusual because usually it was on men, white males, and certain age. But what I tell people about anger is, because when I worked with kids in the partial, I said, what are your body cues? Okay, what is happening is constrict, and it prevents blood, oxygenated blood to your brain. Therefore, you cannot think. And I would tell parents, don't ask a kid what is wrong.
Or why'd you do that?
Yeah.
What a terrible
You
question.
should have the faces, emotion faces, okay? You can, after you settle down, point to what
Right.
you're feeling. And then when they're getting angry, it's identify your body cue. What is your body telling you? Are you clamping down your jaw? Are you pissed? Or whatever it is. So that tells you you are in that anger mode or the snake brain. So you take a nice deep breath to open up those little blood vessels so that you can think. And you can take a break, and then we'll talk about it later.
I told every one of my teenagers when they came to me before on their first day, at some point you'll probably get mad at a teacher. When you get mad at a teacher, you'll be sent to me. I'm going to give you 2 gifts, and I'm going to tell you what those 2 gifts are right now. The first gift I'm going to give you is the gift of time. Because what I know is this. If I talk to you at the moment that you're angry and start asking you questions like, why are you mad? Why did you do this? What you're going to do is this. You're going to go off. Now, my goal is to get you to go down. But you want to go off. And if you go off and you cuss at me, I don't care. I've been called worse things. That doesn't bother me. But you know what you might do? You might say, I'm going to kill that son of a bitch. Now, as soon as you say that, it's out of my hands. Now I've got to turn it over to the police. I'm going to give you the gift of time. The second thing I'm going to give you is this. When I start to talk to you, I'm not going to talk about what happened. I might ask you, you said you were going to go fishing this weekend. Did you catch anything? Now, why do you think I'm going to do that? Get into the human brain. I want to get you out of your snake brain before I get you to talk about it, because I want to engage you at the human brain level, not the snake brain level. Because if I engage you at the snake brain level, you're liable to do something that you and I both are going to regret later. And it takes it out of my hands. I want you to remain in control.
If what's wrong is a terrible thing to ask an angry teenager, what's a good thing to ask?
Go ahead, Molly.
You said what's wrong is a terrible thing to ask.
Well, when they're in that midst of...
Yeah.
Well, it's just, Greg
What
just
do
told
you
you.
need from me?
Yeah, you just said
Yeah,
it.
you just told me, yeah.
What you have to be careful is getting somebody who is already there to go deeper, because there's many different levels of anger, and the last thing you want to do is to get somebody at a deeper level. The first thing, and one of the best things to do is to engage before you're ever angry, to say, if you're ever angry, this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to engage you. If I'm angry, I'm not going to talk to you. And please don't force me to talk to you, because it's a great relationship tool. Because we need to talk about things, but we don't need to talk about it when either of us are angry.
Okay.
Because when we're angry, we're liable to say things that we don't intend to say. Maybe
Seems like most of these shootings, whether it be in the mall, school, or whatever, they usually shoot themselves.
Yeah.
What's the rationale?
in one of the slides that I had that I didn't show, Malcolm talks about 3 different types of anger. First type of anger is explosive anger. Explosive anger is what I deal with most every day. These are kids who are angry and they show it, and as scared as we are of it, they're our safest kids. Because we know exactly where they're coming from. And we're dealing with it. The second type is repressive anger. These kids are much more dangerous. They start with vandalism, slashing tires, but they're much more likely to do violence to themselves or others when it's unexpected. The most dangerous type is what he calls implosive anger. And I point out, I hope I don't hurt anybody's feelings or talk about a situation in this community, but I use a couple of examples. Remember the shooting at Target in front of everybody when the murder-suicide. Remember the boy that basically kidnapped his girlfriend from Sears, took her to the graveyard, killed her, killed himself, set the car on fire. Those are what Malcolm says are the implosive. Those are the most dangerous. And that's a big part of his training, because he said they're out there. We know they're out there. We get gut feelings about them. But what the media always says after these things is, oh, we just didn't know. There was no signs. He said, bull. There were clear signs that we missed, and that's inexcusable for us to miss the signs of Newtown, Connecticut. It's inexcusable for us to miss the signs of Virginia Tech. Those things are inexcusable for us, and it just shows how little value we place, our politicians place, on the mental health of our citizens. we know those people are out there. We won't catch all of them. But you know, it was the week before last. There were 5 mass shootings in 5 days. No, I'm sorry, 6. Monday through Saturday. That's inexcusable. Inexcusable. And the response is, we'll give everybody a gun. Come on. You know? Yeah, you take angry people and then put them in their snake brain and then give them a gun. And yeah, they're going to take care of it. And we know it's the wrong thing, but that's what our society says to do.
I just wanted something more about normal life in our.
Steve, you're gonna have to talk to the microphone.
Oh, well, I'll just talk. Frustration. Let's just make something that's completely not in my life here. So it's, let's say you have a relative who moves in with you, and because they don't have a job or something like that, you bring them into your home, and you give them a room, and weeks go by, they don't clean their room, they don't help with the dishes, they don't do anything that you think a guest in your house might do. So you become frustrated. Is that the snake brain, or is there any way that at some point you're a little bit tense about this and maybe you have to tell them, hey, or maybe you have told them, clean your room, you know, or something like that, but they will not do it. How does that just kind of
What we do in terms of training, I've got like practice. One of them is like a coffee cup with drips in it, you know, and the drips are little things, but at some point it causes the cup to overflow. And yes, the little things build up and build up and build up. And once again, I think Pam probably is better than me therapeutically on what to do with this. But yes, you have to confront those things in your life that cause you frustration. If you don't, then it will turn from frustration to anger. Yes, I do believe that.
Does your example apply to kids?
Yeah. I said it's what I used an adult just so we're not always on the kids, you know. I mean, they're full-grown people that won't clean their house, you know.
I would suggest the same principle is still there, not that it's not reasonable to want things to be different or to want that person to act differently, but I would say it still results in the emotional response of fear. Fear I'm never going to have my house back, fear I don't have any control over my own life, fear I don't have a choice, helplessness. So I think the emotional response, not that it's not reasonable and logical and rational and all that to have different expectations, but the emotional response is still one that's about fear of not ever getting out of this.
I'll expand on that and say, I think there are certain religious traditions, and Greg, I know you in Buddhism, I think that really the tradition is based on much more of the antidote to some of the fear-based stuff. I mean, through meditation and gaining control and being able to let go of things and not be, I think a lot of that is a tradition that is sort of an antidote, whether you're a follower of that religious tradition or not, but the practices are clearly different than what we see in our traditional Judeo-Christian approach, which is to confront and aggressively those things which we don't agree with.
One more, can I just?
Yeah, sure.
There's a lot of psychologists or a lot of thinkers, at least, seem to believe in the books I've read. One of the books I've read is called The Believing Brain by this guy named Michael Shermer. And he opines in that, or says that there is a lot of psychological or a lot of information from the psychologists suggesting that throughout history, there's basically 2 essential natures that people have. And one of them is conservative, and the other one is progressive. And that if you study history, you will see the interplay of the people who want to keep things the same, basically, is somewhat what you're talking about.
I think very much.
And then there's the people who want to move forward. And that the interplay of that creates a friction that creates a slower and maybe a better progress
that's why I say, as much as I know I lean left, I try to stay central, because I know that not all arguments on the right are wrong, and all arguments on the left are right. You know, so I think that it is the interplay between, yeah, creating change, being open to change, but not allowing things. I think that if things are constantly changing, then it's chaos. And so there needs to be stability. And so there needs to be this interplay between those two sides to propel us forward in a direction that's helpful to humanity. Yes?
My sister used to ask me, why do you get so mad? I get very angry at administrators.
Yeah.
And so one day it came to me, and it was such a relief. Well, it was because one, they were a man. Two, I was manipulated, so was my mother by her brother. And once I realized that, I no longer got angry. Because I realized he is not my uncle.
Right.
You know, I feel like he may be manipulating me, but now I'm not getting angry. And it's such a blessing.
Well, and Pam mentioned before about a cognitive approach. I think that what I'm talking about is the whole cognitive approach to psychology, which is you take things that you don't understand them, and bring them up to the cognitive realm so that you can make choices rather than being subjected to the whims of your emotions.
Well, and one comment, I wasn't sure how to say it, but I think that kind of sums it up. I talk a lot about Buddhist psychology, and that's what that's about.
Yeah.
Understanding, and I've done a lot of self-analysis and understanding. I'm not to the point of really being able to change, but at least I understand it.
Right.
And the first step is to understand it, and then once you understand it, you can change.
Yeah, and once again, I think it's that tradition, and some of what I've heard in the Jewish tradition, there's some of that too.
Oh, I was going to say, I know we have to go, but I want to take a second to interject, because I think it's just terrible that 49% of liberals thought that new lifestyles were degenerating our society.
That was 2000.
I think it's probably
10 years ago or whatever. What were they thinking?
They've been better point.
Oh, yes, Kate. I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask your take. According to my reading, when everybody's iron, crime goes down.
Huh.
And the idea there, no one was breaking here to rob us, and you could fire back at them.
Yeah. I don't know that I would agree with that statistic, and I'm not sure where, I know places like NRA like to produce that, but
Well, it makes sense to me.
I don't think it really makes sense when
I
you look at
wouldn't
the,
trust me to carry a gun.
you know, just if you look at the number of deaths in the United States versus every other country in the world, I don't think it makes sense. The places where you see the most deaths are the places where there are more guns. In war zones like Afghanistan, Iraq, the United States. We're up there with most of the most violent countries in the world that are currently in armed conflict. So my personal belief is I don't believe statistics that say things like that. I think all you have to do is watch the news, and it contradicts any research.
But I think you get in trouble watching the news.
Yeah, that's true. but you know, I'll watch the news very much with that same thing. Are they trying to scare the hell out of me? Yeah? And when they do, I stop paying attention to, or at least filter it through that cognitive filter of, as soon as they start with, I was flipping this morning, and on Fox, it came on, and the first thing out of the mouth was, this week we found out that the horrible thing about Obamacare. You know, there's the fly in the coffee again. Everything is about Obamacare. Despite all the coffee.
Still can't figure out why. I think Socrates says the life on the exam is not worth living.
Yeah, I think.
Well, how do you get somebody to examine the life? What's the kicker for that?
Yeah. Oh, man. Somebody brighter than me could have answered that one. Well, thank you for the
Oh,
conversation.
thank you.